Good evening. My name is Maine Castillo. I'm Town Hall's program manager. On behalf of the staff at Town Hall Seattle, it's my pleasure to welcome you to our presentation with Diane C. Fujino and Robyn Magalit Rodriguez. Their new book, Contemporary Asian American Activism, Building Movements for Liberation, is the subject of tonight's talk. As we get underway, I would like to acknowledge our institution's stance on the unceded traditional territory of the Coast Salish people, particularly the Duwamish. We thank them for a continued use of the natural resources of their ancestral homeland. We are so glad to have you join us tonight. The presentation will run about 60 minutes, including Q&A. To submit your questions for our speakers, please enter meet.ps/Fujino. We'll drop this link in the chat as well, and you can submit a question at any time. We'll try to get to as many questions as possible. You can help us by keeping your own question concise. Also, a reminder, if you'd like to view the program with closed captions, click the CC button in the bottom right corner of the video player. Town Hall is adding new events and podcasts every day. Upcoming events include Lewis Gordon with Ngugi wa Thiong'o on the revolutionary act of Black consciousness and Howard W. French on his vital reframing of world history that centers Africa and African people. Visit our website to join our email list and get the latest updates as more programs are added throughout the season. Town Hall's work is made possible through your support and the support of our sponsors. Our civic series is supported by Real Networks Foundation and True Brown Foundation. Town Hall is also a member-supported organization, so I'd like to thank all of the members who are joining us. If you share Town Hall's vision of a community strengthened by discussions about civics, science, and culture, where everyone has a voice, please consider supporting us by donating or becoming a member. Lastly, you'll absolutely want to dig into tonight's topic by purchasing your own copy of the author's book. Please use the link in the chat below to pick up your copy through the University of Washington Press. Diane C. Fujino is Professor of Asian American Studies at the University of California, Santa Barbara. Her research examines Japanese and Asian American activist history within an Asian American radical tradition and shaped by Black power and third world decolonization. Fujino is co-editor-in-chief of the Journal of Asian American Studies and sits on the editorial boards of CAUFU, a journal of comparative and relational ethnic studies, and the Journal of Civil and Human Rights. She is featured in Aoki, a documentary film, and has spoken on the history of Asian American, Afro-Asian, and Third World liberation struggles on NPR, Democracy Now!, CBSN, NBC Asian America, and many other networks. She is the author of multiple books, and her writing has been published in the Los Angeles Times, San Francisco Chronicle, and on Al Jazeera Plus, Discover Nikkei, and many more. Robyn Magalit Rodriguez is Professor of Asian American Studies at the University of California, Davis. She is the first Pinay, Filipina born in the United States, to serve as chair in the Asian American Studies Department's 50-year history. She is also the founding director of the Busan Center for Filipino Studies and is a widely published and award-winning scholar. Please join me in welcoming Diane C. Fujino and Robyn Magalit Rodriguez.
Thank you so much to everybody who's joining us tonight. I am Diane Fujino, speaking from Santa Barbara, California, the unceded ancestral lands and waters of the Chumash people. Robyn and I are deeply appreciative of so many who have made our book possible. Too many to name, but we would be remiss if we didn't name a few. The University of Washington Press and their long-standing commitments to Asian American scholarship. All the staff have been terrific to work with, but we need to give special recognition to a truly exceptional editor, Mike Backham. We want to thank the Seattle Town Hall team for organizing tonight's events, and we want to thank the incredible contributors to our anthology, all dedicated organizers and thinkers, and to my amazing co-editor, Robyn Rodriguez. I couldn't have had a better partner for this book. This book emerged when Robyn and I emerges from our longstanding commitments to liberation for Filipinx, Japanese, Asian American, Black, and many other communities in their fights against white supremacy, racial capitalism, and imperialism. Um, we are grateful for the work of Asian American activists, journalists, scholars, artists, and everyday people who are writing about, creating visual and moving images, and in other ways making visible Asian American activism. This was crucial because as we were creating this anthology, we were in the midst of the pandemic. There was much attention to anti Asian violence and racism, but even then there was lesser attention to activism by Asian Americans, and yet we have a very long history of this type of organizing, including from the Asian American movement of the 1960s and 70s, a really vibrant movement that has so many lessons to learn. Thankfully, there's a growing body of literature studying Asian American activism, but most of this has focused on that important period of the 60s and 70s. With notable exceptions, there's very little to narrate and analyze the current Asian American activism. And so, with our anthology, which is the first of its kind to focus on contemporary Asian American activism, we hope that this will shape public awareness of the rich history and current day Asian American struggles and help to shift the narrative around Asian Americans. By focusing on Asian American activism, as our book does, we work to resist the model minority storyline and its logic to erase any need for resistance. And as you'll see as we narrate the 14 chapters in this book, the focus on Asian American activism reveals how anti Asian racism operates for Asian American people and communities, how attacks on Asian American women in Atlanta certainly reflects racism and misogyny, but it's also an impact of US militarism and imperialism in Asia, and that activism has so much to teach us about third world and cross racial solidarities, and the need to think relationally about Asian liberation intertwined with Black and Indigenous liberation, and the liberation of all peoples, which was a principle of the Asian American movement. Our book highlights collective leadership and collective care, and the work to resist not only domestic racism, but also global imperialism. I want to make one point about our book, which is that we really strove to center organizing knowledge or the production of knowledge that arises from people, whether working on the streets, in community based orgs, in schools and universities, doing cultural work, whose struggles engage the question of how do we create change? This book is not a manual for organizers, but it does narrate contemporary Asian American organizing and reflects lessons, as in the book's subtitle, Building Movements for Liberation. I want to read one passage from our introduction that I hope illuminates our ideas. We distinguish between activists and organizers. Activists work for social justice in a myriad of ways, including short term, one off, and supporting actions. Organizers do the deep and sustaining work to develop campaigns with long term objectives and grapple with strategies that can achieve a more equitable distribution of power and resources, the building of social movements, and ultimately a liberatory society. We hope that learning from the knowledge of organizers and activist scholars in this anthology can help to inspire people to deepen their critical thinking and activist practice and help to transform activists into organizers. Because we believe that social transformation arises through praxis, or the unity of theory and practice, we believe that both study and struggle are necessary and intertwined components in our collective work towards creating emancipatory futures. We next turn to Robyn, who's going to talk about how this book came into being. And after that, we will give an overview of the chapters of the book. And finally, we will open up to a conversation between the two of us before we open it up for Q&A.
Thank you so much, Diane, for laying out what the book does and its significance, not just for the scholarship on Asian American activism, but also for the movement. And how this book came about is really a really great story. One of the important themes of our book is really looking at intergenerationality and the ways in which intergenerational relationships are a really key mode by which the Asian American movement continue to have an afterlife and continue to have an afterlife, even in contemporary Asian American organizing. And so much about this book is about intergenerationality. Now, our particular relationship, our intergenerational relationship, although, Diane is just a bit ahead of me generationally. But the truth of the matter is, I was introduced to Asian American studies as a field of study and as a political practice or a political project through Diane, who was my professor. Diane was teaching, I believe, her very first course in Asian American Studies at UC Santa Barbara. I was in my final year at UC Santa Barbara. I believe she was in her first quarter at UC Santa Barbara, teaching an Asian American Women and Feminism course. She walked into that course and it changed my life. I didn't imagine, I don't think I'd ever imagined it possible that an Asian American woman can occupy that place at the university lectern as expert, and her being present, that really kind of was so deeply impactful for me that I could see myself doing that work. And of course, more than that, what Diane taught me is that Asian American studies is more than just kind of a field of study in which one can kind of be an expert, but that Asian American studies is really also a political project, a commitment to teaching and researching for liberation. And really that model of activist scholarship or scholar activism is something that has inspired me through the years. It's what prompted me to go and pursue my doctoral degree. And over the years, after I finished and I entered the professoriate, Diane and I would connect over and over again, primarily in the space of Asian American studies, and really work together to continue to try to bring activist knowledge into the field, to really center activist knowledge. I think for the both of us, we recognize how much the field was born out of activism and some of the early knowledges, that the field had relied on were activist knowledges, and we really wanted to do that work of bringing that activist knowledge back into the center of our field. And so we would connect over and over again around scholar activist sessions in the Association for Asian American Studies as a AAAS. Also, we would come together to co-edit an anthology on Asian American activism in the leading journal in Asian American Studies, or the very first journal in Asian American Studies, Amerasia Journal. So there's a real coming full circle for me personally, but it also is a reflection of this intergenerational relationship, this book. In terms of the actual coming together of this book proper, we organized with this intention of bringing a book together. But what we did was organize a symposium first at UC Santa Barbara, so my alma mater, where Diane continues to be, during the occasion of the 50th anniversary of the Asian American, for the 50th anniversary of the fight for ethnic studies, including the fight for Asian American studies. We organized with great intention, not just to hold an event, a symposium to mark the 50 years of the ethnic studies struggle, but really with the intention of bringing together organizers across generations with this vision of producing this book. And there were two parts to our coming together. So initially there was a public symposium. So we had all of the contributors, or most of the contributors, that is, of this book come together to present on their work, their organizing work, in a public symposium. And then we had this closed workshop where we were able to really dive deep, not just into kind of the book and what we were hoping for the book, although that was a crucial part of our closed workshop. Really, our closed workshop was also to dive deep around big movement questions. We were motivated to not just produce this book as a kind of archive of the Asian American movement or Asian American activism today, but really that this book have help to shape activisms on the ground today and in the future. And so the closed workshop became an opportunity for us, and I think a rare opportunity really for many of the contributors who, you know, are so in the thick of struggle on the ground, often don't have space and time to be able to come together from across sector issue areas or sectors or even geographies to really dive deep into big movement questions. And we were able to provide that opportunity at UCSB through this this symposium and the coming together, this closed workshop. So that's sort of the story of the book. It's a wonderful story, and it's a testament to intergenerationality and how these relationships can really spark and inspire newer generations, as Diane did for me when I encountered her first in a classroom over 20 years ago. So I'm going to turn back now to Diane to talk about just the book proper. We'll be talking about each of the major sections. We're going to be showing a slide deck just for this section. So I'll go ahead and pass it on to Diane.
Thank you, Robyn. Thank you. So you can see the cover of our book here, which we're really pleased with. And next slide, please. What we want to do is go over the contents of the book. The book comes together in 4 parts with 3 chapters in each part. The first part looks at incarcerations, displacements, and transformations. And it leads out with Eddie Zhang, who you see pictured here, who was a former prisoner in San Quentin State Prison in Northern California. And while he was there, he worked to get an Asian American Studies class, to get ethnic studies there. And the prison officials found this so threatening to them that they ended up punishing them for this kind of organizing and put them in isolation and made it very difficult for them to do this work. And in this chapter, Eddie narrates the struggle that they did for ethnic studies inside prisons, as well as the kinds of lessons that you learn. Like he says, you can't expect to, you can't expect rewards, right? You could expect to be punished for making social justice demands, but that punishment isn't always the worst thing. And that one of the things that came out of that for him were some beautiful relationships. Yuri Kochiyama and others started writing to him, and they later formed the Asian Prisoner Support Committee, which exists to this day, doing really important work around deportation. And Eddie worked with that organization for many, many years. The next chapter is by Karen Umemoto, a professor and director of Asian American Studies Center at UCLA. And she did this work while she was in Hawaii as a professor there of urban studies. And her piece reflects is her self-reflections on her collaborative community research project that helped to develop alternative pathways to the juvenile justice system in Hawaii, where Native Hawaiians or Kanaka Maoli are disproportionately imprisoned on their own land, right? We've seen this story before. And what they tried to do was use Kanaka Maoli values and epistemologies to promote an ethos of healing and restoration. And she narrates the kind of research in this project that it was. And the third section is by Angelica Cabande with Catherine Nassau, and it's looking at the work of SOMCON, or the South of Market Action Network in San Francisco. And prisons aren't the only ways to create displacements. And what SOMCON is looking at is struggles against housing displacement and gentrification. And Angelica Kambande is a SOMCON organizer. And in this, she narrates their campaigns, which involves an effort to listen to the community, to involve the community in their struggles, and to discuss the history of so-called urban renewal in the city. Next slide, please. Part 2 looks at the ways that internationalism and the local are intertwined. And we start with a chapter by Guyang Chung, who is a professor at UC Davis with Robyn, looking at undocumented immigration activism of Korean Americans. And we know that in this struggle for immigration rights and liberation, Asian Americans are often ignored and left out of both undocumented populations, as well as the struggles around undocumented immigration rights. And Gayang Chung discusses this, and she does it as both a researcher and as someone who got involved in the organizing that was happening at the organization she was studying. And she did her research in Los Angeles, Chicago, New York, and in Virginia as well, where she worked closely with Korean American organizations and really tried to resist this ways in which Korean Americans are placed in the model minority box, and that she tried to resist the binary between deserving and undeserving or disposable immigrants. She critiqued the meanings of citizenship and inclusion in her work, a really fabulous chapter. The next chapter in this section is an interview that I was fortunate to do with Javed Tariq. This is not Javed Tariq, but this is a member of the New York Taxi Workers Alliance. And Javed Tariq is a former taxi driver, as well as the co-founder and senior staff member of the New York Taxi Workers Association Alliance and a treasurer for the National Taxi Workers Alliance. And in this interview, Javed Tariq narrates the incredible work of the New York Taxi Workers Alliance, including their work to resist splitting labor. For example, when Uber and Lyft drivers flooded the New York um, roadways and displaced taxi drivers, they could have separated the two, but instead they used a model of labor organizing based on unity and solidarity. And in this way, helped to resist the growing part-timization and precarity of drivers in the neoliberal gig economy. They also worked nonstop to support taxi drivers as they picked up workers from the airports as frontline workers who were vulnerable to COVID. And in their first 3 or 4 months of the pandemic, they fielded 10,000 calls and emails from drivers. And the last chapter in this section is by Jessica Antonio, who is in the national leadership of Bion USA, and she narrates Bion USA, which is one of the most important US-based Filipino organizations struggling for democracy and transformation in the Philippines, engaging Filipinos in the United States. And she's particularly interested in thinking about the process of politicalization that leads Filipino Americans to engage in transnational activism. And she looks at, in particular, the exposure programs led by Bion USA that enabled Filipinos in the US to travel to the Philippines to meet with all different sectors of Philippine society, including youth, peasants, and the urban poor, and uh, it narrates the ways in which this program was transformational for many. So these chapters show that internationalism and the local don't need to be separated, but in fact come together and shape each other in important ways.
Now, I'll talk about parts 3 and 4 of the book, if we can get to the next slide. Thank you. Part 3 is political education and radical pedagogy. So, of course, this book came out. We organized this book at a symposium that was really marking the 50th anniversary of the establishment of ethnic studies, including Asian American studies. So political education was really important to us as a thematic. And we have in this part, Mei Fu, who is an activist scholar, also working at the university. But in her case, she's working at the University of San Diego. And her chapter is entitled Political Education as Revolutionary Praxis. And what's really exciting about Mei's chapter is that she's looking at the ways in which, in effect, ethnic studies or Asian American studies, how that political education gets done, or how ethnic studies and Asian American studies, which we typically find at universities, gets done in the context of struggle and movement. So she's looking at political education, specifically in a Southeast Asian organization that she worked with and studied. But again, looking at the ways in which this ethnic studies, the way I kind of understand her chapter, how ethnic studies and Asian American studies gets taken out of the university and really done in the context of struggle and movement. The second chapter in this particular part is by Catherine H. Lee, entitled Organizing Wherever Your Feet Land, Reconceptualizing Writing and Writing Instruction in the Legacy of Asian American Activism. What's really, really great about this chapter, and actually if you, we didn't get to talk about it too much in the breakdown of each of the parts, but you might notice that there are chapters that are written with an individual, or in the case of Diane's chapter in part 2, it was an interview. So basically what we tried to do that's also very novel and innovative in this book is we really were mindful that organizers, sometimes the writing process can be incredibly intimidating and challenging. And so we partnered in some cases graduate students with our contributors to help them with the writing process. And Catherine Lee worked specifically with Eddie Zhang and also with Pam Tao Lee, and she reflects on that process and what that did for her. And in her in this chapter here in this part, we also have a chapter by Soya Zhang, who works with Change Lab in the Pacific Northwest in Portland. And what's the title of her chapter is How Does It Feel to Be on the Precipice? Change Lab, a Racial Justice Experiment. And what's interesting and important about Soya's chapter is that she maps out this new ways in which Asian American movement how the Asian American movement is also in the present moment, how Asian American organizers and activists are experimenting with new kinds of organizational forms. And so Soya reflects on what it looks like to have done this work through Change Lab, which is actually an LLC, a kind of experiment organizationally in doing movement work. And that is the focus of her chapter. Really, really interesting. And I think she's very, very well known and beloved in the Seattle community. So it's great to have her as talk about this book in this venue, and having Soya be part of that book. Can we move to chapter 4, please? Next slide. So chapter 4 is on movement building, shaped by the past, creating new futures. As I said earlier, intergenerationality is such a key theme for us. It was really, really important for us to be able to trace out the ways in which activisms today can find their roots in the Asian American movement. Alex Tom is a contributor for this part on his chapter on movement praxis in the age of Trumpism. So Alex Tom often refers to himself as a Gelder, who is somebody who was very much mentored by people who were at the forefront of the Asian American movement of the late 1960s and 1970s. He's emerged as a kind of Gelder, a young elder, who is really deep in the work of trying to not only carry on some of the lessons from the Asian American movement, but really trying to strategize around how our movement praxis needs to shift in the context of in the context of Trumpism and the new kinds of challenges we face in the United States today. I did a chapter actually reflecting on my student organizing, actually while I was a student at UC Santa Barbara and a student of Diane's, and actually working alongside Diane. I worked on this chapter alongside my graduate student, Wayne Japanda, who is also an activist scholar, looking at some of the student organizing we were doing in the 1990s California, in my chapter, Pete Wilson, Trying to See Us All Broke, which is a line from Tupac. Also in this part 4 is a chapter by Pam Tao Lee, who is a movement elder to many of us, including Alex Tom and myself and others who are in the volume, who talks in her chapter about the struggle to abolish environmental and economic racism, Asian radical imagining from the homeland to the front line. So in this work, she's both reflecting on her own work in kind of in the beginnings of kind of the environmental justice movement, especially when the environmental justice movement was really starting to pivot toward really grappling with racism and white supremacy and the ways in which white supremacy structures our lived environment, the environment. And she reflects both on that kind of early work as well as thinking about kind of our futures. And I'm sorry if I'm kind of rushing through this part because I'm noticing the time, and I also want to make sure that we have plenty of time to speak, to have a discussion with Diane and I about our hopes for the book and for the movement. But before I get to that, let me just quickly, next slide, encourage everybody. We've gone through an overview of the book, but of course, we really, really hope you pick it up yourself and read it. And we do encourage you, if you're in Seattle, of course, you can order from the University of Washington Press, but do support your local bookstore. We really encourage you to go to Elliott Bay Books as well to get the book. The address is there for those of you who are joining us from Seattle. One of our chosen distributor for this book, beyond for folks outside of Seattle, is Eastwind Books, based in Berkeley, California, and you have the link there. So I wanted to really transition now to a discussion, thank you, of our hopes for the book and the movement. I should mention that there is an epilogue to this book, and it's a little hard for me to talk about this epilogue. You know, the truth is, this book in so many ways is such a, it reflects my life and my journey, really. First as a young person in Diane's class, then as a scholar activist, and even as an activist mother. And so the very end of the production for this book actually happened within weeks after my eldest son passed away. He was 22 years old, had decided after doing a lot of organizing in high school. He was biracial, Black and Filipino, did a lot of organizing with the movement for Black Lives while in high school, continued some of that work into college, was at the forefront of anti-gentrification campaigns in Oakland, California, where he was born and where he was enrolled as a community college student, and then decided to go to the Philippines to work alongside and learn from Indigenous communities at the age of 20 in 2018, and then found himself when the pandemic happened, stuck in the Philippines. And so he passed away in early August of 2020, just as we were kind of wrapping up prediction for this book. And many of the contributors, including Diane, really felt like it would be appropriate to write an epilogue that kind of recounts Amato's life and his work, because in many ways, really, and Diane and I, when writing this book, our audience really, what we had in mind was the generation Gen Z. We had in mind the millennials, all the students that we were encountering in our classrooms, and our worry for them, that in a moment where activism was happening primarily, it seemed, on social media, where connection was happening on social media, political education happening in social media. I think we were really, we felt really the importance, again, of bringing some of these generational knowledges in the form of a book as an invitation to study. And, as a kind of ending to this book, or this epilogue, as a member of Gen Z, Amato was born in 1998, was 22 again at the time that this book came to its conclusion and when he passed. In so many ways, he represented the hopes of the movement. He was very much committed to being present. And one of the things about Amato was his social media profile was very sparse. He didn't really engage politically there. He was engaged in building relationship, being in the streets, being in neighborhoods, organizing in that way. He didn't like actually calling himself an activist. He did, in fact, call himself an organizer. When he was in Oakland, he went to seek out and build relationships with elders. He had really close relationships with Panthers in Oakland who continued to work in Oakland, built relationships with movement elders in the Asian American movement. Clearly his work was about solidarity, partly because he's biracial. It necessarily meant that he was organizing around his multiple identities as Black, as Asian American, as Filipino. He was committed to internationalism. really felt the importance of learning directly from the most marginalized in the world, the people kind of at the front lines in the Philippines who are dealing with the ravages of climate change, the ravages of extractive economies, and what that does for Indigenous peoples. And so, I think for us, and in many ways, though his passing was untimely, he does represent our hope for a generation, that our hope that there are ways that this Asian American movement has all these wonderful lessons. And in his hands, as a member of Gen Z, he was able to kind of manifest some of the best lessons of the movement, and also to teach us even more. I mean, among the things that he taught us really was around mental health. One of the big things, because he was a real advocate and proponent for mental health, the importance of kind of slowing down, self-care, but not self-care in a way that's sort of about being closed off and disconnected from community, but really doing this work of community, collective care. So, we really, really do hope that he and the book become an inspiration for Gen Z. And just pass it on to you, Diane, just in terms of, again, thinking about all the things that we hope for with this book, because of course, I think for both of us, the book doesn't end with just it being published, right? We really have visions beyond getting it in the hands of readers.
Yeah, thank you, Robyn. And I think that, we move from Pam Talley, who was the keynote speaker at our symposium in 2019 and who has over a 50-year history of engagement in the radical Asian American movement. She was part of the struggles on different campuses. She was at Hayward, but on different campuses, all in the Bay Area, that were connected in the struggle for ethnic studies and the building of the early Asian American movement. And she worked with Iwar Kun. And then, as you mentioned, Robyn, she really became a major environmental activists who connected environmental justice with racial justice. And we moved from Pam Talley to Amado, right? And they both are doing some of this work. So we're seeing that intergenerational connection, but they're doing some of this work that is really intersectional, linking racism with environmental justice, connecting international with local, as Amado went to the Philippines to work, and Pam has worked locally, but she's also worked internationally, including major support work for Philippine independence and liberation, and Black Asian relations and third world solidarities. There's just so much that is here in this book. And, we really hope that this book helps people to ask questions, right? To learn about Asian American activism. We feel that the people who are involved in it, in Asian American studies and in the movement, know something about activism. There's a lot on the internet. There are ways to connect with this. And yet at the same time, the Asian American activism is one of the most understudied and under-narrated social movements out there. And we hope that people learn more about Asian American activism, but then ask questions about how knowing about the history and presence of Asian American organizing shifts our understandings of so much Asian American communities, racial regimes, the ongoing impacts of militarism and imperialism abroad, as well as on communities at home, as Atlanta shows us some of that kind of work. It creates a real shift around the narratives about the needs for resistance and protest. Um, and so we hope that it does this kind of work and draws out some of the key um, characteristics of Asian American activism. Some of it has to do with the ways in which the international is, I think, so present in so much of Asian American organizing on the ground. Some of it has to do with solidarity work and the ways that Asian Americans, it seems like, really it's one of the things that Asian American activists are engaging with, to different degrees and in uneven ways, but really focused around, struggling around anti-Black racism, making connections, but not seeing the two as completely parallel, but also seeing ways in which one cannot uplift their own communities without thinking about how any policy impacts all groups, and that we need to be in connection and solidarity with everybody. And that I think this idea of relational leadership is something that I really have as a takeaway from our book and from the symposium and from the ways that so many of the organizers work within our within the the authors in this book. And I'm thinking about Catherine Lee, who you mentioned, right, who at the time was a graduate student at UCSB, and she was the project coordinator for our symposium. She also had been a writing instructor, and she was studying the ways that writing works to both, I guess, decolonize the mind, right, to free one's thinking, as well as her research was looking at how writing programs needed to be constructed to create truly transformative change. So when she was working with Pam and Eddie on and supporting them, they developed this beautiful collaborative relationship. And she did support them in their, they knew exactly what they wanted to write. It wasn't that they needed help there, but she helped to get it all on paper. But she learned so much from them, from these two ferocious organizers, right? And she saw the power of writing in the work that Pam and Eddie were doing to connect writing to urgent needs and to help to enable us to find what she says, this collective collaborative process and innovation. And so it really shifted for her the ways that she was thinking about writing by working with Eddie and Pam and being part of this anthology.
Yeah, no, thank you for that. That's right. I see some questions popping up from our audience, Diane. So one of the questions has to do with our thoughts on the model minority myth and whether we should, as a population, I'm guessing Asian Americans, move away from oppression comparison. Well, I
Yeah.
guess I could start. I mean, we tackle the model minority myth pretty head on in the book, in the introduction. I mean, among the things that we critique about the model minority myth is the fact that it does obscure the fact that Asian Americans have been very much active in struggles for liberation, and so part of our you know the impulse in bringing this book together was about being able to contest that model minority myth in the ways in which it obscures generations of social change making and liberation work on the part of Asian Americans. I mean, that there's that. Of course, the other issue for us is we share this critique of the model minority as a myth that was really rooted in anti-Blackness. For us, we understand the model minority myth as a construction born out, in fact, of the very same moment of both the rise of the Black liberation struggle and the Asian American movement of the late 1960s and 70s. It was really manufactured, produced, and disseminated precisely as a means of trying to minimize the kinds of claims on the part of Black radicals. And so we're very, very critical of the model minority myth. And I think for us, it's less about comparing oppression. I think what our framework is that white supremacy has shaped all of us, all peoples of color. Now, it has shaped and impacted our lives unevenly and differently. That's why it's very important for us to come from a very intersectional lens, because of course white supremacy works alongside of heterosexism, transphobia, patriarchy, also all sorts of ableism, other forms of oppression. And for us, it's less about oppression comparison and really more about understanding the ways in which white supremacy differently operates in our lives, and how the importance then of developing these kinds of an intersectional lens and a praxis of solidarity. So, I think that, at least I would say that's sort of how I kind of think about our approach to the model minority myth. If you wanted to add more to that, Diane.
Yeah, absolutely. And I want to add one more component to it, which is the ways that it connects to global empire building. And so one node of the model minorities, when it gets really popularized in 1966, as Robyn's narrating, at the moment that we can say Black Power emerges, if you will, with Stokely Carmichael making the call for Black Power and the Black Panther Party forming. And so it was used, as you're articulating, to discipline Black militancy, Black radicalism. But the other node is a decade earlier, or 2 decades earlier, right after the end of World War II. And you suddenly see, Japanese Americans had just been incarcerated. My parents were among that. My family was among that. Um, and they quickly are given awards for military service and sacrifice. They're quickly, these stories emerging around success stories. There's an opening up of the suburbs in ways for Japanese and Chinese that didn't happen in the same ways for Blacks and others. And so there's a sudden emergence, and people, Japanese Americans who were seen as the enemy, are now suddenly seen as model citizens. It was surprising in many ways, and it led people to ask, why was this happening? And one of the reasons has to do with international relations and the US in the aftermath of World War II rising to global power and wanting to show itself different from European colonialism. And yet it was expanding, especially in Asia and the Pacific. And so showing a reduction of racism in the US, in particular anti-Asian racism, was productive for the US as it engaged Japan as a junior partner in its expansionism in it had occupied Japan, right? It was controlling Japan in certain ways, and it was also very much trying to contest the rise of Mao in China. And so there were productive reasons for this emergence. And so at this moment, right, so many decades later, it is still the dominant narrative. I hear people say, do we really need to talk about it? Yes, within Asian American studies, within the movements, people have critiqued it up and down, but it is still the dominant narrative. And I think that the work of focusing on activism and looking at the ways that so much of Asian American activism, I mean, there's such a broad range, but so much of it engages in critiques of imperialism and racial capitalism and heteropatriarchy and is seeking transformative justice. And I actually wanted to ask you, Robyn, about uh, what you envision as necessary to get us towards transformative liberation, right? And the questions of what is the role of reform and what kinds of reforms are we talking about in this work?
Sure. No, thank you for that, because I think it really does kind of connect to one of the other questions that has come up about the work of social justice progress. So I guess the question is, do you see much of the work of social justice progress moving away from activism at the forefront and more towards the deeper organizing, or does revolution require both? And I think it does relate to this question about kind of reform and radicalism, which are big questions that have always been, present for organizers and activists, right? I think, in my view, and I think this came up a lot also in the closed door session that we had with the contributors, is this idea that reform is that genuine transformation and reform don't have to be seen as sort of kind of diametrically opposed or oppositional. That in fact there is a function for successful reform, in the sense that on one hand, reform opens up political space for actually more organizing and work to be done. It allows us to grow. It opens up political space for movement growth. On the other hand, just, these wins become important. However small and incremental some of these reformist wins might be, they do also demonstrate that change is possible. And it's something that emboldens us to then fight for even more. And I think that that's also, what the function of reform can be when we're kind of thinking about transformative revolutionary change. And so, so that's how I would kind of respond to kind of that query around kind of reform versus kind of more radical change. Now, even in connection to this question about activism and organizing, again, I think it requires both. I think it is important that people feel activated, that individually people kind of do that work of responding to issues of the day, and standing up and voicing out, speaking out, and taking these kinds of individual steps. But I do think about activism typically as in some ways kind of very individualized. Sometimes it's in connection with movement. There are times when it isn't necessarily always anchored in movement, especially the kind of work that happens, I think, at least in social media, is primarily activist as opposed to organizing work. Organizing work, for me at least, really requires the relationship building. It is really coming together in a collective space, working together collectively and crafting kind of an approach to organizing around issues. It's about being accountable. And I think that's, we do need that. And I think our worry, and partly again, why we wanted to do a book like this, is the worry was that these lessons around organizing were not being made available in the ways that we wanted them to be able to be available to a younger generation.
Yeah.
Dan?
Yeah, absolutely. And I agree with you that we need activism and we need organizing. And I think the challenge is, right, to recognize that there are things that exceed activism, right, in the ways that we and others have talked about this, right? And it is important, and people will enter where they are. And that's also one of the principles of organizing, right? That you meet people where they're at and then try to move them, right? Or they move themselves. They teach. And but I think that we want to think about, right, what is our vision, what is our radical imagination, what is the society that we really want to live in, not just the society that we think we can get. And it will take a kind of boldness, it will take a courage, it will take taking the risks, right, to try the impossible, to do what we think cannot happen. Because otherwise, if we just try to get what we think we can get, we just are always reaching for low hanging fruit. And often what we end up getting then are the things that are maybe a tad bit bitter, but not really what we want. And they're so easy to co-opt and to undercut at any moment. And so that's why, we call this the subtitle, Building Movements for Liberation. We think that it's going to take much more thinking beyond, thinking for the campaign win, which is crucial, right? We need these victories, but thinking beyond that, right? In what ways is this going to get rolled back, right? In what ways is working within institutions, in my mind, you know, there is a necessity, it may not be for everyone, but there's a necessity of transforming government structures. And at the same time, recognizing that power can always undercut and co-op and change what we've gained in this one moment. So thinking ahead, right? And I think there's also a difference between, as people are talking about in the abolitionist and other movements, right, reformist reforms and non-reformist reforms, right? So if the reforms that we're getting are just these creating reforms and that's sort of the goal, that's problematic. But if there's a larger, more transformative goal that we're striving for, and in the process we're gaining non-reformist reforms, then this is what makes sense to me as efforts to do. And this is crucial. For example, in the abolitionist movement, this becomes really crucial to think about, right? Like what for police reforms, what reforms actually move people away from a system, right, that is oppressive, and creates safety in ways that doesn't or reduces harm to communities, right? These are crucial questions that our contributors raise.
So we're coming close to time, but there is a question that has been posed about how activism and organizing has changed since the pandemic and since the rise of publicized hate crimes against Asian American people. I don't know if you wanted to take that, Diane. I can also speak to that, of course, too.
Yeah, I think that, well, but please, Robyn, because I'm seeing the next question, which I think I'll take on leadership. So
Okay, sure,
please,
sure,
please,
sure.
please,
Sounds good.
please.
Yeah, yeah,
Mhm.
yeah. Well, what I can say is this, and this sort of goes back to the model minority myth in the sense that what what was interesting is how surprised sort of people in the mainstream seem to be with the rise of anti-Asian hate. But I think for many of us who have been organizing in the Asian American community, we knew it as soon as the news broke about uh, the pandemic in China. We knew exactly to anticipate that Asian Americans in the United States were going to experience some kind of backlash. And again, Diane spoke to how international relations, the ways in which the model minority myth was crafted in the broader context of U.S. imperialism. But it's also true that international relations, or the U.S.'s relationships with countries in Asia, have always had an impact, right, on Asian American communities in the U.S. Clearly, in World War II, for example, it's trade wars with Japan, trade wars with China that has had an impact on the spiking of anti-Asian hate. So I guess for Asian Americans, as the pandemic hit, I think we were already responding. We knew that this was going to come, and we started organizing almost immediately. I can kind of share my own local experiences. I organized with other Asian Americans even as shelter-in-place orders where we're all kind of began to shift our work to Zoom, or through Zoom and other kind of online platforms. Asian Americans, at least in our region, I live in what's known as the Greater Sacramento region, or what is really Plains Miwok land. Asian American organizers were connecting across different kind of nonprofits, of folks who may not have had an organization that we're working with, because we knew, again, to anticipate that anti-Asian hate was going to rise. And we immediately kind of organized ourselves, to demand that public officials really take a stance on against anti-Asian racism. But we also organized to ensure that the model minority myth wasn't shaping how public health officials were going to approach the pandemic. Because one of the things we were finding was that public health officials didn't think that Asian Americans were going to be disproportionately impacted by COVID, because we're all presumably middle class and kind of insured and all of that, when in fact that's not true. And so, there's definitely been a lot of really amazing organizing happening during the pandemic. On one hand, you have kind of seasoned organizers who have been creative about using online platforms to organize. You've seen new formations be created during the pandemic, including the organization that I helped to form here, the Asian American Liberation Network. So definitely, I think for many Asian Americans, there has been a new recognition of the ways in which white supremacy shapes our lives. If for some, if some had kind of bought into the model minority myth or experienced life in model minority ways, I think that the pandemic really revealed the ways in which white supremacy continues to shape our lives. And it has definitely spurred new kinds of activism, which hopefully this book can kind of lend some lessons and direction to, because I think that there has been a kind of initial frenzied kind of response on social media. And I'm hoping that response can be sustained over time. And I think that there are so many lessons from our movement, Elders and Yelders, in this book that I think can help ensure that some of that initial activity will be sustained over time, as part of, this longer term liberation work. And I'm sorry, I think we only have a few more minutes, but hopefully you can tackle this question, Diane, in the time that we have.
It says, on the topic of leadership, what are your thoughts on gender and activist leadership among Asian Americans? I will try to do a super short answer, which is to say that when you look at the Asian American movement of the 50s and 60s, I think one of its hallmarks and one of the things that we really can learn from Asian American activism is that it had a spotlight on collective leadership. This doesn't mean every organization, there was sexism in some organizations more, but in other organizations, women were really in the leadership, and that this model of collective leadership, where leadership was shared and rotated, where people had charge of certain committees or certain aspects, but they worked with others who were in charge with other aspects, I think is something that we can really learn from today, and something that I think continues to the present in Asian American activism. Now, I think this raises the question of horizontal or flat leadership. And my view is that while we want to be collaborative and collective and egalitarian and equitable, to have things be leaderless or completely horizontal where there's no division of tasks that people are charged with becomes very confusing and difficult, especially it may work in certain instances, but if you're trying to build bigger campaigns or movements for liberation, then I think it does require leadership. So that collective leadership is leadership, but it's one that's egalitarian and opens up space for women and others who might be seen as more on the margins to get involved and whose experiences are valued. And I guess I want to say this, that in this anthology, there's stories time and time again of the ways that listening to ordinary people's experiences and voices becomes the knowledge that guides our organizing. I think we might be out of time, Robyn. I don't know how we want to end it, but I think I just want to pay tribute to all of the amazing Asian American activists and organizers across many generations, and shout out to those who are doing such hard work today. May you have strength and energy, and may we collectively organize and think about how we're going to build those movements for liberation.
I just want to thank you both so much for coming to Town Hall virtually. I wish you could be here in Seattle, but your story of coming together and writing this book is so beautiful, and you were able to educate our audiences, and I just thank you so much.
Thank you so much. We really
Yes.
thank Seattle Town Hall and
Yeah, of
love the
course.
city of Seattle.
Oh, good. Well, hopefully you can come here sometime. And for our audiences at home, please remember to buy a copy. We have a couple of great local bookshops in the chat, and you can buy that through the link. Thank you both so much again, and thank you everyone at home. Have a great night.